856 will be the next hymn. We'll use it as the invitation hymn tonight. We thank you for being here again this evening. We are so blessed with a good number once more. And one of the difficulties, if you're new here tonight, one of the difficulties as we study the book of Revelation is that it's kind of an ongoing study. And so if you've missed a part of the past, I hope you can catch up or at least try to understand where we are at. We are, and one of the things that I find that is difficult with you and I here in America is that we have a perspective of the church as being in America and a perspective of the church being only American. But you see, the church has been in existence for 2,000 years. And so, it has gone through many, many different countries and has existed in many different countries. Many laws and many governments, of course, have been over it and all those things. And so it's sometimes hard for us to be able to grasp what the church has had to face through all of those years. And so that's what Revelation is. As we studied last night about the one who is on the throne, God himself had a book. And that book had 7 seals on it. And those 7 seals were locked to where no man could open them. And we were told that there was one who could open it, and that was the Lion of the tribe of Judah and the root of David, which is Jesus Christ. And he had the ability and the power to unloose the seals. And so last night we unloosed those seals, or we looked into what was under the seals. And we went through, of course, to the 6th seal, and that's where we ended last evening. And what we have been doing is we have been looking at the system of sevens that are recorded. There are 7 seals, there are 7 trumpets that are blown, there are 7 vials that are opened. And as I suggested, these are periods of time. And they are in succession, as I firmly believe that the book of Revelation is a book exactly of that, of Revelation, revealing God's Word and revealing time. And we pointed out last night in our study that God was holding in His hand, as He held that 7-sealed book, He was holding the future of the world. Just like the song we sing, He has the world in His hands. He holds the worlds in His hands. And so He had that, and it was made known unto us. We came to the 6th seal. And under the 6th seal, there is a period of time that seems to stand still for just a little while. Because under the 7th seal, in the opening of the 7th seal, we go back and start over again. We go back and we start with number 1. And we go on through, and when we come to the last trumpet, and that's going to be the description of the end of time and the things that are going to happen at the end of time. It's kind of interesting that the Apostle Paul says that the trumpet shall blow. And I believe that's the 7th trumpet that the Bible refers to here in the book of Revelation. So in our study tonight, we're going to be opening that 7th seal. And there are 7 angels. You see, Revelation's a picture book. There are 7 angels, and they're standing there with a trumpet. And when they blow a trumpet, which is kind of a suggestion that an announcement is going to be made. There's going to be a procession. There's going to be something. And the Romans would do this. They would blow a trumpet to let you know something was going to happen. And so these 7 angels, and they are blowing a trumpet. And as each trumpet is blown, John sees something. There is a vision that is given to him, and he describes it, of course, in a language that you and I are not accustomed to. A language of symbolism and metaphors and pictures and visions and so forth that he had of these things. And so it is up to us to try to figure out what those things mean. And by applying the facts that we have of history, I believe that we can come to a pretty close understanding of what he was talking about. Remember, these are things which are affecting the church. This is the changes that the church has gone through. And as I pointed out, I will say this again, that governments in our land affect the church drastically. They affect it. The Roman Empire was in control for hundreds of years. And we're going to find out tonight that power finally ended in 476. And there were other powers that came into being. And those powers controlled the church. And if you don't think that the government can control the church, you just think about 2 months ago when they closed down our churches. Our government has that power, and the Roman Empire had that power, and all the other governments had that power. So they do control religion, and if we let them do that. I kind of like what the Apostle Paul said, though, in the book of Acts, the 5th chapter, when he was told by the rulers and the government of the land that he could no longer preach in the name of Jesus. He said, we must obey God rather than man. Brothers and sisters, there comes a time when we must take a stand. And I'm certain in the future there will be such occasions as this again, that we must take a stand, that we will worship God in spirit and in truth as we are instructed to do so, even if it means disobeying the law, because that's what Satan wants. Satan wants us to give in. He wants the churches to fold. He wants, of course, Christianity to be destroyed, and that is how he's going to accomplish it. And we'll notice a little bit more about that, I think, Sunday in one of our sermons that we have there. So let's just jump into the sermon here tonight and look at, first of all, going back to chapter 7, because this is the slide we ended on last night. In chapter 7, I hope that you did your homework. I asked you to read chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9. And in that, you'll find some very interesting things. Chapter 7, remember the sixth seal has been opened. And let me just take you back to what that sixth seal represented. I believe it represented the time of Constantine, which came in about the year of 325. You'll notice we're at 400 here tonight, but about the year 325, Constantine came into power in the Roman Empire. And there was a great change in religion. For the first 300 years in the history of the world, the church was persecuted in one form or another. Even though it was a prosperous time for them because the Roman Empire was engaged in constant civil wars and so forth, and it allowed the church some freedom to grow and to prosper, yet there was still this paganism and the laws of paganism, the laws of the Roman Empire controlling the religions of that time. And so they did not have the freedoms that they wanted. But in the coming of Constantine, that freedom was given unto them. Constantine was a Christian, or his mother was a Christian, we are told. His mother was baptized, she was a Christian, and so he favored his mother's religion. And he allowed Christianity to become the religion of the state. And I've said a couple of times, I say it again, that it was a bittersweet thing, because it was sweet in the fact that Christianity now was in front, paganism was being destroyed. Constantine demanded that all of the temples and the altars for pagan gods to be destroyed or turned into churches, he said. So it was a glorious time for the age of the church. It was bitter in the sense that what happened was the government now had control of religion. Constantine was the emperor, and he was in control of things. He was making the laws for Christians and so forth at that time. So, it was, as I said, a very bittersweet thing. But in chapter 7, we find several things. And the vision appears, and it tells us there are 4 angels that are held at the compasses of the earth. And there's an angel in the north, one in the south, one in the east, one in the west. And these angels are there to bring swift destruction to something. But there's an angel that comes to them and says, wait a minute. Let's just wait a while. Let's wait until there are those who will be sealed of God in their foreheads, which I believe represents there are those who will become godly. There will be those who will become Christians. And so there was a period of time of waiting that people would again become of a godly nature. He describes these people as John sees them, actually. And he says there's 144,000, and these were of the tribe of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. And he names the tribes here in verses 5 through 8. And there are 12,000 out of every tribe. And there are religions who seem to claim, well, then that means there's going to be 144,000 of Jews in heaven. No, it doesn't. It is a figurative speech. It is a figurative number, because there were 12 tribes, and because there were, the 12,000 in each one of them. It does not signify a specific number. That's where people make a mistake in Revelation. Revelation is a book of mysticism and a book of figures. That's where people make a mistake about the 1,000-year reign. We're going to talk about that probably Sunday night maybe. But the people who believe in the 1,000-year reign think that Jesus is coming back again and dwell upon this earth for 1,000 years. How can you take a book that is figurative all the way through and then come to this one number and say, this is it? This is literal. This is literal. You can't do that. You can't do it with 144,000 either. And he goes on in this particular chapter, and he talks about how that there's, besides these Jews, there's a great multitude which no man can number, because there was no certain number of tribes and so forth. These are the Gentiles. And he says, people, kindreds, and tongues stood before the throne and before the Lamb, verse 9, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, Salvation to our God, which sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb. So there's this period of time after the overtaking by Constantine, where there was some reprieve, I believe, in Christianity. In this case here, the angel tells them to wait, the seal of God being in the foreheads. And then we find that the 144,000 would be taken out of the tribes of Israel, but not an exact number. And then there was a great number, which would be the Gentiles. The symbolic picture would be those who would be saved during this great period of time. They were taken, the record says, they were taken out of the tribulation. The tribulation that had been placed upon the people of God at that time. Verse 14 says, let me read you verse 14. And I said unto him, Sir, thou knowest. This was a question that had been asked by one of the elders. There's 24 elders around the throne. And one of the elders asked John, he says, John, who are these people that are robed in white? Who are these people that are here pictured before you? And John said, you know who they are. I thought that's kind of interesting. The elder says, John, who are these people? He said, you know who they are. He said, these are they. So the elder said, these are they, which came out of the great tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And so the meaning, I think, of the entire chapter 7 is that it is a chapter talking about those who suffered during the long period of persecution in the first 3 centuries, for the first 300 years of the time of the church. And they were now being rewarded. And I place here in emphasis, Christianity won. At this point, Christianity has won. Even though there had been great persecution, people have died, suffered, been martyred, and so forth, Christianity won, because now it's on the move again. Now it is rising because of the freedom that was given unto them through this good emperor, even though, as I said, there were some bad things that happened and some bad things that he did. All right, let's move on to chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. And there's a statement made in verse 1. And when he had opened the 7th seal, so now here we are. The 7th seal was opened. When he opened the 7th seal, the angels, the 7 angels, begin to blow their trumpets one at a time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And 7 will come to in another sermon. But he says there was a space of half an hour. There was a space for a half an hour. Again, it is a period of time. It is not necessarily directly a half an hour. But what I like to think of this little statement is this. It was the calm before the storm. There was a space of a half an hour that nothing seemed to happen. Nothing great to be mentioned. Nothing great to be wrote down. No tragedies, no sorrows, and so forth. The calm before the storm. Verses 3 through 5 refers to the raising up of prayers. And that's the suggestion, at least, as he talks about the angel took a censer and he filled it with fire and the fire of the altar, and he cast it on the earth, and there was voices and thunderings and so forth. This all is a reflection of prayers that are being lifted up to God during this time. The purpose of all these visions was not only to warn the saints of dangers, but to also prepare them for the things that were to happen unto them. And so we come to the blowing of the first trumpet. The first trumpet is found in Revelation 8, verse 7. Here's an angel, and he blows a trumpet, and John sees this vision. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood. And they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. I was talking to Mike today. He said none of that makes sense to him. All of that stuff, what's the green grass being burned up mean? And what does the third part of the trees and the hail and fire mingled with blood and all of that? This was, again, just simply what we call apocalyptic literature. It was language, again, that you and I are not familiar with. But they were familiar with it in this time. They were familiar with this type of language where you would use a symbol to represent something else. And so the folks in that time would certainly know, at least when this happened, I suppose, they would know what was happening, what was taking place. So what do we say about this? So far, we have followed the history to about 325, 337 was from 325 to 337 was the rule of Constantine and the power that he had. So if our historical view is correct, we would find an answer to this vision following that, because we're going in a line of succession here of history. About the year 400 AD, the four winds were set loose. And the first four trumpets are these four winds that are set loose one at a time. The last three trumpets are called the woe trumpets. But these are the four winds that are set loose upon the earth to allow things to happen that would happen, of course, to the land, to the people, and certainly the church would be in this area. I refer to the Goths here. And again, if you've studied history, you've heard of this people. And what is amazing to me, as powerful as the Roman Empire was, you would think that there would be nobody would be able to rise above it. But that's not the case. In the case of Daniel, the 2nd chapter, you have the story of the various kingdoms. There's 4 kingdoms, and King Nebuchadnezzar was number 1. And the Bible says he made King Nebuchadnezzar the king of all kings, and that even the animals and the fields and so forth would honor and would obey this individual. And it leads us to believe that no one would be able to conquer King Nebuchadnezzar. And yet, a weaker country, the Medes and the Persians, was able to conquer the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. And they did so easily. They came into the city there where he was, and where his son was. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar had died. Belshazzar had come into power. And they came right in through the sores and came up and conquered the city. A power that was the most powerful nation in the world. And this happened and has happened over and over. And the people that I'm talking about here tonight, you'd wonder how in the world these people could conquer such a power as the Roman Empire was, that had been in existence for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the domain that they had and so forth, to be able to take those domains. But the Goths, who were known as barbarians, you know, the Bible talks about them, don't they? The Bible uses the phrase several times, the Greeks and the barbarians. The Greeks were a people who believed that they knew all the answers to everything. They were philosophical, and they had to reason everything out and so forth. And so the Greeks thought that they were the prime society of the world, and everybody else was barbarian, which simply means you were ignorant. You didn't know anything. And so the Goths were known as barbarians, and they came out of Germany and Austria, kind of that area, which is north of Rome, and they came out of there as a people that nobody knew about. There was an uncharted territory. If you'll recognize the Roman Empire, it was all south of Rome, clear down into Africa. And I've got some pictures here I'll show you. But the area north, nobody knew about those people up in there. And the Goths were one of those people. And the leader was Alaric, or Alaric, whatever, I don't know how you pronounce it, but Alaric was the leader of the Goths. And they, of course, came from the unexplored north. They embarked on the nation of Rome. They came southward, and they embarked on the nation of Rome, and in their path, this is historical fact, in their path, they burned up everything that was in the way. Just like Revelations 8 and verse 7 says, that the trees, the green grass was burned up, the trees was burned up and so forth, and they left scarred, torched, blackened, bloody, desolated lands. Countries blooming like gardens were turned into treeless deserts because these were barbarians and they didn't care. They weren't a people that enjoyed beauty, and so they destroyed everything that they could. In 409, under the king Alaric, they descended on Italy. It had never seen the face of an enemy in 800 years. 800 years, no one had ever even tried to come and destroy Italy. Now, Rome was a power that went out and conquered many nations, but they went into those countries and they took those countries. No one had ever attempted to come to Rome, to come to Italy. But now, for the first time in 800 years, Italy is overcome. At last they gathered around the imperial city of Rome. And after a long siege in the dead of night, the gates were opened by traitors and the barbarians rushed in. For 3 days, they sacked the city of Rome, leaving behind nothing but blood and spoil. This is a fact of history I'm talking about. This is a major event in history, enough that it found its place in God's great book. Then their leader, Alaric, died, and they left the city loaded with spoil. Of this invasion, remember I've been referring to Gibbon. He is a historian. He is not a Christian. He does not write to tie in with the seals, but everything he says ties in with the seals. And here's what he said. He said, the tremendous sound of the trumpet stirred the host to invasion. That's what he said about this invasion of the Goths. The trumpet, think about that. That's the first trumpet that blew, and Gibbon describes it, even though he wasn't quoting from the Bible. Blood and conflagration and the burning of trees and herbage marked their path. Now let me show you a little bit, I like to see maps when I'm talking about a place. And so let me show you what we're talking about here. This is the Roman Empire at its height. There is Spain. There's Gaul, or France as we know it, but Gaul was the original name for it. You got Italy and Rome right there. That was the capital of it. And then, of course, they had the power all down in northern Africa and over in Egypt, Judea, Asia Minor, Macedonia, Greece, and all of this. That red is the Roman Empire in its heyday. They had conquered all those countries, and it belonged to the Romans, and people had to pay their taxes to the Romans. Here is the area, Judea, that's Jerusalem, and that's where we're familiar with, but you know, even in Jesus' day, the Romans were in control, and it was the Romans who had to make the decision to execute Jesus. The Jews did not have that power of their own. Now, let's go look at another map here. Because here is a map of the whole kind of entire area. But if you go back here, you'll find that even Britain up here, a part of it belonged to the Roman Empire. But as you come here, you'll see that there's this whole area up in here, the Ukraine, Poland, Germany, and so forth, Romania. All of that was uncharted territory. It was territory that the Romans had never even thought about going into. And here's where all of the armies came from, down into Rome, and to destroy it. And so that is the Goths. Here is the kingdom of the Goths. Eventually, in 409, Alaric came, and they were called the Ostrogoths. But here is the territory. They took all of Rome. But you'll notice that they did not take the pink part over here, which was the eastern part of the Roman Empire. If you remember last night, we talked about Constantine. He moved the capital to Constantinople, and the Goths did not bother that part of the world at that time. But they were able to take and to maintain the kingdom of what's called the Western Empire. At least they were able to control it. All right, here's another area of it, this yellow area here, the Gothic alliance of Alaric, it says. That was in 410. So let's go to the second trumpet now. That's happened in the year 410. We come on up about 12 more years, and it says in the second trumpet, the second angel sounded, and as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea. And the third part of the sea became blood, and the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. What do you think he's talking about there? He's talking about the sea, and he's talking about a war that was going to be on sea or at sea. The Goths completed their work about 409 or 410, somewhere in that vicinity. There was another movement about 10 years later. Another mighty horde of barbarians was sweeping southward. Another group entirely coming down because they had heard of the fact that the Goths had been able to conquer Rome, and so they were going to come and take their part of it as well. And this tribe was called the Vandals. It is from the word vandals that we get vandalism, which of course gives you a suggestion as to what kind of people these were. They were just filled with all kinds of vandalism. But the fact about these people is that they rushed over Gaul, they came through France, they swept through Spain, and then they crossed the Gibraltar there, the Straits of Gibraltar, and then they took the northern part of Africa. They took all of that, France, Spain, and all of northern Africa, if you remember my former picture there. And the Vandals took all of that. Then they turned themselves, once they got into Africa, they turned themselves into sea warriors. They threw themselves like a burning mountain, just as it says here, into the sea and filled the sea with blood. In order to assail Rome, they built fleets and they struggled for the mastery of the Mediterranean. For 600 years, there had been nobody that could fight them on the sea. The Romans not only controlled the country and the world by land, but by sea also for 600 years, until the Vandals came and they built their ships and they began to fight the Romans from the sea. Fleets met in the shock of battle. They said the sea was reddened by the blood of the slain. The islands of the sea fell into the hands of the Vandals. 30 years this battle went on between the Romans and the Vandals on the sea. The city is besieged. They finally got to Rome. The city's besieged. It falls, and for 14 days, pitiless barbarian army spared neither sex nor age. It didn't make any difference if you were a woman, if you was a child. The Vandals destroyed it. They would kill you. And this happened within the city of Rome itself. The spoils were carried away in the Vandals' ships. They blasted, they scourged, they pillaged. The capital is abandoned as an unworthy to be held as a permanent possession. Surely these facts fit the picture that we have in this particular seal, as he talks about the sea and the sea becoming red with blood. Let me show you. This is the invasions of the Roman Empire. Now, there's a lot of invasions in this particular map, but the one that I want you to look at here is, of course, the Vandals, the purple. You'll notice the Vandals came out of the north again. They came out of that area of Germany and the Ukraine and Poland and so forth. And they came out, and then they come over, came down through, this was France or Gaul. They came down through Spain. They took all of northern Africa, and then at Carthage, they sent their ships out into the Mediterranean Sea, and they conquered all the islands, finally coming to Rome. And so the Vandals, out of Poland, Ukraine, and the German area, they were the people, I believe, that is described in this particular trumpet. All right, the third trumpet. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. And it fell upon the third part of the rivers, and upon the fountains of the waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. Now, what do you think he's talking about here? He's talking about rivers and the battles that would be engaged in rivers. You see, rivers were a great dividing line. If they were any size at all, this was, a place that the enemy would meet on one side, and if you were the victor or whatever, you'd meet on this side. So rivers was a great battlefield, because it became an obstacle that you had to be able to compete with in order to be able to win the war. And this particular group of people, it seems that all their battles was engaged at the rivers. Who are we talking about? The burning star. Remember what a star is when it falls? It is a dignitary, it's a king, it's an emperor or something. That's what a star or the sun and the moon refers to. It's a leader who suddenly appears and he does injurious work. Before AD 40, The Romans knew nothing of what we call now the Hungarian nation. They knew nothing about this nation. As I said, these were people in the north that they knew nothing about. In 440, the Hungarians suddenly appeared as a meteor would flash through the sky. They appeared, listen to this, folks. This is it's just awesome to me. They appeared on the Danube River with 800,000 men under the leadership of Attila the Hun. I know you've heard about him. I know you've studied about him in school, Attila the Hun. And he comes with his forces, 800,000 men. That'd be hard to deal with, even with the power that Rome had. They had come from the depths of Central Asia, marched north to the Euxine Sea. They went through Russia, and now they knocked at the river boundary of the Roman Empire. Overcoming their opposition to their passage of the Danube, they rushed westward to the river Rhine. And then on the river Marne were met by the host of Rome, by the armies of Rome. Historians tell us that the blood of the slaughtered heroes made the river run with blood. And that from 150,000 to 300,000 bodies of the dead attested to the fury of the contest. It just boggles my mind. You know, we talk about wars today, World War I, World War II. We're familiar with those things. The Vietnam War and the Korean War and all of that. We're talking about a major conflict here that 150,000 to 300,000 men died on the rivers, and the rivers flowed with blood. Then they desolated the river Rhine to its mouth. Turning southward to the banks of the river Rhone, they were again met in a fury with the Roman warfare. And then descending from the Alps, the fierce warrior came to the banks of the river Po and contended for the mastery of Rome. But he never did enter. Attila the Hun never did enter Rome, because victoriously he marched southward to seize the imperial city, but he was unable to contend any longer. Rome sent an embassy, kind of like what Jesus says, if you can't fight him, send somebody over there to talk to them. And that's what they did. They sent somebody over to talk to him. They worked on his superstition, and they succeeded and got Attila the Hun to leave and not actually to come into the city of Rome. When he left, he made Buda. I don't know if that's Buda, Texas. I doubt that it is. But he made Buda on the river Danube his capital, and he founded what we now call the Hungarian nation. It's a small nation, but it was founded by Attila the Hun. In the river Danube, here's an interesting fact. When the leader Attila the Hun died, the followers of Attila the Hun turned the waters of the Danube from its course. That would have taken a major work. They cut a channel so that the Danube River will be turned from its original course, and they buried Attila the Hun beneath that river. And then they opened it back up again so that the Danube would flow in its original course with the bones of Attila Hun under that river. He was called Wormwood in our Bible. I think it fits the description. It is a very definite piece of history. Attila the Hun trying to overcome. His name, as I said, was Attila the Hun. Here's a picture. This was just the effort that he had done in France. And you can see these little buildings where there's smoke going up. These are all the ones that he was able to sack. These were all the cities that he was able to go in and to destroy. And you'll notice that all of them are kind of based on rivers for some reason. I don't know if they used it for being able to travel or whatever, but all of his efforts seem to be based around the rivers. Here is, of course, Attila the Hun. This was the empire that was finally established. Of course, Hungary's not that big today, but this was the empire of Attila at the time. And here's the capital, but you can see how that he came down into Italy and never did get to Rome, but he went back to his capital, and there on the Danube River, which is right there, that's where his bones are buried. All right, let's move on. The fourth trumpet. Now, he says, in the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so that the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. Remember again, the stars and the moon and all that refers to dignitaries, emperors, kings, powers of authority. So if a third of them are gone, something would be, it is suggested that there'd be something that would be a third of it entirely gone. It would be eliminated by whatever this particular trumpet would signify. We have learned the Goths, they struck here in 409. We've learned that the Vandals struck in 422. We learned that in 440 the Huns, the Attila the Hun came against the Roman Empire. And so whatever we have coming up here is going to be something that will follow that. That's 3 winds that have blown, and 1 more wind is left. The last invasion of Rome was in 476, which was the final destruction of the Western Empire. The final destruction. This destruction came as a result of a person that I don't really know too much about, and yet it must have been very significant because, to entirely destroy an empire, that's what this individual did. Heruli was the people, and Ottokar was, of course, the leader of this group. It was a northern race, once again, coming out of actually East Germany. And by the weakness of the falling empire, he decided he would go and try to do what he would be able to get out of this helpless city. Augustulus, who was the emperor at the time, was hurled down. The Senate of Rome, that had met for 1,228 years, was driven from the Senate chambers, and there was no more. No more Senate, no more emperor. The mighty fabric of the Roman Empire went to the dust, and great men fell to rise no more. The sun, the moon, and the stars, emperors, princes, and great men are smitten. They lose their power, and they cease to give their light. The Roman Empire, the western part of the Roman Empire, had ended. There began at this time what historians refer to as the Dark Ages. It began about this time, maybe even later, up into the year 500. But this is the Dark Age because as I pointed out the other evening, the Dark Ages was a period of time when the Word of God was taken out of the hands of the people. But the literary world believes it's because Rome was destroyed that the Dark Ages started. That there was now no longer, because of the barbarians that were ruling the then known world, that there was no great literature, there were no great plays, there's no great paintings and so forth, like you have in the arts. All of that was gone. And for the next 1,200 or so years, there was nothing like that. But I believe it has more to do with the fact that the Word of God was taken out of the hands of the people. The fall of Rome introduced a period when intellectually and spiritually the day and night was darkened, when the mind of men was blinded, and when the church gradually fell into apostasy, and the light of God's Word was very feeble. The 4 winds have blown. The 4 trumpets have been blown. Now the 3 woe angels will declare their last part of the history. Here is, of course, the journey that that individual, Heruli, he comes down from the north up here. He comes down and he finally takes Rome, takes Italy. And so he also goes over, of course, and takes all of this territory in here. The Heruli people, and Ottokar. And here is Ottokar. Here is, of course, the domain that he holds on to for a period of time anyway. All right, the third part. He talks about the third part here. I'll just briefly refer to that a little bit, because I think what happens here is that in the history of the world, historians believe there were 3 major groups of people. There was the Greeks, there was the Saracens, and there was the Franks. The Saracens is another word for the Arabians. So you had the Arabians, you had the Greeks, and you had the Franks or the Latins. A third part of these now are gone. And so the Latins or the Franks have been destroyed, and they are a power no more. Another historian says 3 classes of men during that interval are conspicuous: the Saracens or Arabians, the Latins or Franks, and the inhabitants of the Western Europe and the Byzantine Greeks. And so a third, as is suggested in this trumpet, is now gone. The civilization of the world was divided into 3 groups, and a third of them have fallen. Let's go to the 5th trumpet, the woe trumpet here as it is described. And the 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star from heaven upon the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. I don't have it all listed here because it actually includes about 12 verses, and I would just encourage you to read those 12 verses. Let me pick out a few of the high points here. As John sees this thing, he says the one that comes is given the key of the bottomless pit. To him was given the key to the bottomless pit. What is the bottomless pit? That's where Satan is. So whatever power this man had, whatever power this government had, came from Satan himself. He had the key to that bottomless pit. He is described as in verse 4. He says that these men which have verse 5. He says, but that they should be tormented 5 months. So these individuals were told that they were not to destroy those that they come in contact with, but that they were to torment them for 5 months. That's important to remember, 5 months. And then he goes on to describe who they were. The shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle. So he saw what he thought was locusts, but they looked like horses. He says they had crowns of gold, verse 7. Their faces were the faces of men, which meant that they had a beard. And it says, and they had hair as the hair of a woman, and their teeth was the teeth of lions, and they had breastplates as it were the breastplates of iron. And they had a leader that was called Abaddon or Apollyon, which of course is synonymous even with the names of Satan. So remember that he says here, a star has fallen. And in this star that has fallen, it again would refer to a leader. He had the key to the bottomless pit. And this leader was like locusts. They had the power to hurt like a scorpion. Locusts were known to come from Arabia, where locusts were plentiful. And so the fact that he used the term locust would suggest to the readers at that time that this was someone out of Arabia, because that's what they associated with Arabia. Locusts usually devour every green thing. These, however, would seek to preserve these things. Rather, they were to hurt men who had the seal of God in their foreheads. Men were not to be killed, but rather men were to be hurt for 5 months. 5 months, again, is a prophetic language. 5 months, if you take a day for a year, which is what Ezekiel 4:6 says, I have appointed thee each day for a year, kind of like the 40 days and 40 years that the children of Israel was in the wilderness. If you take that, 5 months would be equal to 150 years. It's important you keep that in mind. So terrible will be the torment that death would actually be desired. Verses 7 through 11 describe what these locusts look like. And I've already described them, so I'll go through it very quickly. Like a horse, they had helmets of gold. They had faces of men. They had hair of women, long flowing hair. They had the teeth of a lion. It signifies their fierceness. There were breastplates of mail. They had iron breastplates on. And the sounds of wings would be like the rushing horses and chariots. Tails of the horses would leave a path of torment. They had a king by the name of Abaddon and Apollyon, which means destroyer, which is also what Satan is. Who was this individual? And who were these people that now fall upon the Roman Empire that had been destroyed, but whatever people was there? Who were these people? The locusts, the horsemen, the scorpions all point to Arabia. I believe this is a picture of the rising of Muhammad. It's the rising of Muhammad. He came out of Arabia. And under the leader Muhammad, who was instrumental for the book known as the Quran, as we know the Muslim religion today, it is believed by Mohammedans to be the sacred writings. We have already found out that the Western Empire was destroyed in 476. And so the very next major thing was the coming of Muhammad and taking over the world that then was. The symbols connected with the timing all point to Muhammad from Arabia. It was the right time, 632 A.D. It was directed against the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which was Constantinople, and of course, that part of the Roman Empire that had been established by Constantine. The Arabians, unlike the Goths, the Vandals, and the Huns, were an army of horsemen. The others were an army of ships, or an army of men and so forth. But these, the Arabians, were an army of horsemen, swift as locusts were. The facts about the Arabs: they came from a home of the locusts. They all fought on horseback. There was not a foot soldier in the army. Every one of them fought on horseback. They wore on their heads something like crowns of gold. We call it a turban. Arabs wore this turban, and that's what John was seeing as these people came in. And they had the faces of men. The Romans, along with all the northern tribes, the barbarians and so forth, they had clean shaven, but the Arabs wore long beards. That was significant of them. They also had the long hair, like the hair of a woman. According to one historian, it says he adjusted himself properly, twirled his whiskers, and folded up his hair under his turban, drawing it from off his shoulders. This is what John saw as these individuals came into this empire. There were breastplates of iron. And again, Muhammad speaks of this in the Quran. He says, God has given you coats of mail to defend you in your wars. And so this was a common piece of warfare that the Arabians, that the Mohammedans, people of Muhammad would wear. More facts: Muhammad was literally a fallen star, which is described here. He was a prince by birth, but he was heir of the rule of Mecca. But his grandfather and his father died while he was a young man, and so he was pushed aside and he became a servant. So he was indeed a fallen star. They had literal orders. The Bible says they were not to hurt any of the vegetation like the Vandals did and the other people. But Abu Bakr, the successor of Muhammad, ordered these words: destroy no palm trees, nor burn any fields of corn, nor cut down any fruit tree. This was an order to the army. And so they were not to destroy the country, but they were simply to bring fear onto the country. Their work was to continue 5 months. That's 150 years according to prophetic time. It was 632 that they came. The Arabs burst forth from the desert to assail the world. Within 100 years, Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, Egypt, the north of Africa, Spain had fallen beneath her sway. They had taken control of all of those areas, as had been controlled by other countries. In 762, the capital of the Arabian Empire was established in Baghdad. It wasn't called Baghdad then, but it's Baghdad, Turkey now, where we know is the kind of the hub of the Muslim faith. And the rulers began to cherish peaceful ideas. After they had conquered that, they cherished peaceful ideas. In 781, the Caliph Harun al-Rashid was their ruler. And here's what Mr. Rashid would say: this was the time of the golden age of the Arabian power. This was the time of the Arabian Nights. Baghdad was called, imagine this, the City of Peace. That's what it was called in 781, the City of Peace. In 632 they started. If you added 150 years, you come to 782, which is the second year of the reign of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. It was at this time that friendly correspondence was finally made with the Christian rulers of Europe. And so once again, Christianity won. Even though, at that time it seems that they were developing peace. And we know, of course, that peace was only short-lived, as they continue today to destroy Christianity. And so here was the empire of Mr. Muhammad. He came from the east, and he took Arabia and all of this, the area that was once controlled by the Roman Empire. And that was in 782. We're coming up in time now. And so we come to the sixth trumpet. This is going to be the last one tonight, so I'm almost done. The sixth trumpet. And the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying, the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are beyond the great river Euphrates. There were four angels that were beyond on the river Euphrates. What would this symbol be? The Mohammedans had control of that area. And it goes on to say here that these individuals had breastplates of fire and of jacinth and of brimstone. And it says the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. All right, what are we talking about here? The four angels represents four agencies which had been restrained. They had been restrained at the river Euphrates. The four agencies are left loose to slay a certain part of man for a period of time. The period of time that is referred to in our Bible as an hour, a day, a month, and a year. And if you take that for a day, for a year, which is the prophetic language, you come up with 396 years and 4 months. That's important to remember, because there was something that happened in 396 days and 4 months that signifies that this is the thing that is described to John. Verse 16 describes an almost innumerable number of horsemen. The horsemen had on breastplates. You know what color those breastplates were? They were red, blue, and yellow. And that's what he said here that John saw. He saw breastplates of fire, jacinth, and brimstone. That's red, blue, and yellow. These men were wearing that breastplate. Horses looked like a lion, signifying fierceness. And out of their mouth came fire, smoke, and brimstone. It was this battle that I'm talking about here that was the beginning of gunfire. Gunfire was now developed. And it was the first battle of all times where guns or cannons and so forth would be used. And as they would see these horses, as John saw them, he saw fire, he saw, of course, smoke, and then he smelt the brimstone. That's what you have when you shoot, a gun. You got the fire, you have the smoke, and then you have the brimstone following. And so this is destroying power. It may be the use of gunpowder, which I believe it was. One looking at a distance would see a flash of fire and then the smoke, and eventually smell the brimstone odor and would see the destructive effects. By this destructive power, the Bible says a third part would be destroyed. Now remember, the first part had already been destroyed. That is, the western part of the Roman Empire. This would destroy the eastern part of the Roman Empire. The fulfillment, we've learned that the Arabian scourge filled its work in 782. It had taken from the Eastern Empire its provinces in Africa and most of its possessions in Asia. And the world, according to Gibbon, was at that time divided into three parts. Two of these have fallen, and one of them is still to fall. A few years before the 1,000th year reign of the Christian era, a fierce Tartar race left their home east of the Caspian Sea. They moved southwestward until they rested on the river Euphrates. This people we refer to as the Turks, or the Turkomans. 2 generations. Here's what's strange about this. For 2 generations, 60 years, they sat on the river Euphrates. They didn't move. They sat there. For some reason, they couldn't go any further than that. So for 60 years, they were on the river Euphrates. And at the given time, they would then release. Jonathan, I'm almost done. You see that crash? They would release they would release their power on the world. Now here's the Euphrates River, and this is where they rested here in Baghdad, around the Baghdad area, and they were just waiting there. The Turks were just waiting there, I don't know for what, but I guess maybe to fit God's scheme of things. And so you have them coming, and at last in the year 1057, which is the beginning of this, 60 years after their appearance on the east bank of the stream, after being bound for 2 generations, they crossed the Euphrates and marched upon the Eastern Roman Empire. The people were called Turkomans or Turkmens, and we call them simply the Turks today. 4 angels. Remember now, he said 4 angels are released. What is significant about this particular story is it's remarkable that there were 4 bodies. There were 4 different groups that went out from the river Euphrates, and they came upon the empire. Gibbon says Malek Shah Empire was divided into 4 principalities under his 4 sons. And so the 4 sons of this individual is the 4 angels that he's referring to that would go and destroy the third part of the world at that time. Let's observe the correspondence here of this movement. They were bound at the river Euphrates. There were 4 groups of them. Their armies were of horsemen, apparently countless. The Ottoman Turks were a very recent period, wore warlike apparel, scarlet, blue, and yellow, just like, of course, is described in this particular trumpet blowing. The first time that gunpowder and firearms were used in battle was during this campaign. In fact, Gibbon says 14 batteries thundered at once on the most accessible places, and that one of them possibly discharged 130 bullets. This was against Constantinople. And they brought Constantinople down. One more point will help us. It has been said that the prophetic period was 396 years and 4 months, and that would begin when the 4 angels were loosed. And if you add together from the year 1057, when the Turkish armies begin to cross the Euphrates River into the empire, by the beginning of the next century, their conquest extended to the Hellespont and embraced all that land known as Turkey on our maps today. The Eastern Empire was soon covered by the Turks and reduced to the city of Constantinople. And here you have that empire. And you'll notice here that the Ottoman empires, the Ottoman Turk Empire, notice this dark red here. That was what they were after, to destroy Constantinople. And then they continually to gain territory. Remember, they were doing this for 356 years, trying to gain all of this power and all of this land. And so this was the territory that they were able to gain, even down in Egypt and, of course, over in Arabian area. In the year 1453, assailed by 200,000 Turks, the walls of Constantinople came down by the use of cannons, the first ever used in a siege. 100,000 of its citizens lay dead in the streets because of this first blow. Constantinople was stormed by the Turks, the last relic of the mighty empire that had existed for 2,200 years was swept away forever. The work was done. The empire fell in 1453. A third part, as the Bible refers to it, was done away. The interval between those two periods is 396 years. But wait, the prophecy even gets a little more interesting. On January the 28th, 1057, is when the people, of course, left Baghdad and crossed the river. 396 years and 4 months would bring us to May the 29th, 1453. And the very day, the fall of Constantinople and the overthrow of the Greek third part of the world. Christianity kept growing worse and worse. Those who were not killed by the plagues mentioned under these trumpets still did not repent. I know I went through this quite rapidly, and I know it's hard to wrap your mind around these things. But you have to remember, this is where the church was. We're not talking about America, and we're not talking about, England now. We're talking about this is where the church was, in Asia Minor. The churches of Ephesus and Smyrna and Philadelphia and Laodicea. And so this is where the church was. This is where Muhammad came out of. Imagine that. That Christianity could be so squashed by men such as him. And yet we know that it was according to divine history, divine plan, that this was what was going to happen. And so, I'm just so thankful to be able to look into these writings here and be able to compare it with what has happened. So here we are at the blowing of the sixth trumpet. There's one more trumpet. We'll talk about that tomorrow night. I promise I won't keep you this long tomorrow night. Just come back and be with us. We want you to hear the finale. We want you to see that Christianity wins again. It does win again someday. So come back and be with us. Never know the minds of those who are present. If you're here under the sound of our voice, we plead with you to come and to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because all of these things have happened, isn't it a glorious thing that the church has never been destroyed? I mean, it just continued on. It was in secrecy. It was hidden in the wilderness and in the catacombs and all of that. But it never was destroyed. It continued on to this very day. And we still have an opportunity to be able to be a part of it. But the thing is, even if the church was wiped out, brothers and sisters, we have the seed. The seed, the Word of God. You can plant it again anywhere you want to. So we have the seed where the church can still be produced. So tonight, won't you come while we stand, while we sing the selected hymn?